Hello and welcome back to Parlay. This prompt was written by True Parley Grandmaster Foot. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about a song by Richelieu called Just a Ride, and the concept of interpreting this type of media, basically about word paintings versus a sort of puzzle one might solve. Mr. Foot says, there's this song that refuses to leave my mind. It's called Just a Ride by the band Richelieu. Richelieu? I don't know. I want to get your thoughts on the lyrics. They are more word painting and poetry than something clear to interpret, but if you have an interpretation, feel free to share it. I have my own thoughts, but I'll have you go in without any input of mine. All I'm going to say is something I've said before. Art is not some puzzle that needs to be solved. I just want to hear what you have to say here. The song is really long, so I'll only have you look at the first half, and I'm especially interested in what you have to say regarding the bold lyrics. Consider this a carte blanche parlay, where you can do whatever you want with the topic. This is the song. I linked it in the description. And then there are the lyrics. So just a few quick notes about what we're going to do in this parlay, and then I'll read you the whole section of the lyrics we're going to talk about. I will tell you what I think of the three bolded sections, and we'll talk a little bit about the interpreting this kind of thing in general, because I have some opinions about the subject. So sure, I gather from you saying art is not some puzzle that needs to be solved. Well, some artists may not have gotten the bill about that. You know, I think there definitely are plenty of people who make things that they would call art that a lot of people like, whatever that matters for, that really are like a puzzle to be solved, or that was how they were designed. I would agree with you that that is not a very valuable way to engage with most art, but I don't think I don't think it's true that it isn't that, just that that isn't I don't think that that's very effective for moving humans. And I gather that that means you do not want me to do one of the things you could do with this text and instead want me to do another thing. I'm going to read the whole text and then we'll talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, basically, I'm going to read the whole thing. There's four stanzas, if you will, of this song, and then there's more of the song. If you would like to listen to the song yourself instead of or as well as me reading it, yeah, you want to jump ahead like a minute to skip over me reading the lyrics. It'll probably be pretty obvious when I'm done, and I've linked it in the description. We can't have the music in the parlay like this because that removes my control over whether it's monetized or like up. You know, for them to be videos that have no ads on them, that I have control over whether they're up, I have to always not include basically any copyrighted material because YouTube doesn't acknowledge fair use. So I la-di-da. Anyway, so here you go. As neutrally as I can, I'm going to read you the lyrics of the song. I do want to say one quick thing about the music before we start. We're going to talk about it more later. So this song is what I might describe as a little bit through composed. You're going to hear me read four, again, stanzas, if you will, of music. And I want you to keep in mind that these are not necessarily verse, chorus. They kind of build over the duration of the sort of first half of the song. And then there's a kind of crescendo, I would describe it as. So the loudness, the tension is building over these four stanzas. Again, we'll get into it more later, but just so you know, if you're looking for like a pattern to the lyrics, there isn't as much of one as in some other songs. Okay, so from the beginning. Wicker wishes hold the flames at bay. No water for the martyr. Oh, what a shame. Progress is a riddle of delays, serendipitously arranged. Watch the embers wither into gray, and the filament fade. Oh, and the filament fades. It is the cause for causing choruses to erupt in front of stages in the dark. It is the cure between the words and what we thought we heard as such, cleverness and sleight of tongue. Ordinarily, we'd find a better fit and organize the message's intent with words and scenes, insinuations, emotional manipulation throughout. For no good reason, I'd deceive you all just to get the point across. And I've been a hypocrite, and I'm certain I have lied, and I've been to nothingness, and barely bothered to survive. And I laughed when your levee broke, to shed tears when nobody rose, to say, it's just a ride. And then again, there's about half more of the song. So, cool. I try to read that as neutrally as possible, which is something that I think is very challenging to do, and we'll talk about that more if we have extra time. But partly because you could easily read this in such a way that it would kind of present an interpretation. And again, I'll just say for now, obviously, if you listened to the song at this point in the parlay, or you will listen to it after, or imagine you had listened to that as sung lyrics, it's almost impossible to sing something. It's almost impossible to read something without like a slant on what it means, kind of what the mood, what the vibe of the thing being read is, which is why I kind of feel like if you're going to share something with people and then interpret it, I'm not saying this is bad, Mr. Food, but it's a little bit of a trap, because it's almost impossible for me to simply tell you what the lyrics are. I kind of have to give a little bit of my opinion when reading it, because there are different ways to express these lyrics. But I did the best I could. If it felt overly stiff, sorry. If it felt well enunciated, I tried. You're welcome. I don't think it was particularly good or bad. Let's go. So I gather that with these lyrics, Mr. Food does not want me to do one of the things that I think is what occur to one to do with lyrics or poetry or whatever, and instead wants me to do one of the other fairly obvious things you could do. So I want to talk about those two things briefly, and then we'll do the one I think Mr. Food wants me to do. This is a big thing. If you're somebody who doesn't find something like this penetrable, who doesn't feel like you can dig into the words and glean meaning or engage with them, I'm here for you. I also get that. I'm definitely someone who, even though I spent a long time majoring in English in college and therefore interpreting literature, whether I think that is valuable or not, you can tell from my inflection of saying that, I definitely still feel a feeling of, oh, I lack confidence. I will follow things through to their logical conclusion is almost how the feeling goes. Like I don't get it, sort of. But I'm here to tell you, I would agree with Mr. Foot's comment earlier that you kind of can't not get it. If you get something from it, that is a useful way to use art. There's two ways of interpreting, is I guess what we'll call this activity, something like this, that I want to talk to you about today, but of course there could be others. The first one is, I think, what a lot of people think of: puzzling out the meaning of the piece. This is kind of in opposition to the idea of the death of the author, where things are treated autobiographically and you can sort of determine the identity of the person or the piece. And this has thankfully, largely faded from professional criticism, though a lot of amateur people consuming something that somebody wrote kind of don't not do this, and I think it's usually bad. People, I think largely that things are something to be solved, and thus they get tangled up in, oh, well, was that what the author meant? And it's like, it doesn't matter. What do you know? And using the following thought experiment, I hope to demonstrate that to you. You might be thinking, well, how can you say that? Like, if the person who wrote those lyrics you just read says, like, it's about their divorce, how can you say it's not about their divorce? It's literally about their divorce, I guess. Okay, but if they said it was about their parasocial relationship with a streamer that is at the same time a dairy cow that just happens to be in front of a GoPro 1 hour every week, that almost certainly doesn't exist, and they just made up something that it's about. That no more affects the text than them saying that it's about something it's more likely to be about. Neither of them affect your experience of the text, other than that if you didn't have an experience of the text and then the author gives you a feasible experience of the text. Do you see what I mean? If the author says it's about my divorce and you have no interpretation of the text on your own, that sounds like a reasonable interpretation of the text. So a lot of audience members, I guess I don't know your life, maybe not you, but a lot of audience members will be inclined to say, oh, so that's what it means. I would argue that this is because it didn't mean anything to them. And the reason why that very same logic, suddenly a lot of audiences would reject that that's what it means if they said it's about my parasocial relationship with a cow that just happens to be in front of a GoPro 1 hour a week. The reason that suddenly they'll reject that, even though it's the exact same logic, the author said that's what it's about, is because that isn't a reasonable interpretation to them of the thing. And you know what? If that story's true, that's very interesting. But it's also interesting what I think about the piece. In fact, I love it when an artist gives a totally like batshit insane explanation of why they made a thing, because I think it encourages people who are too worried about what it means to think about it for themselves and say, well, I don't think it means that. They're claiming it means that seems crazy, right? And I don't know, people who make art are weird. Like, for all I know, there is a dairy cow streamer that's serendipitously in front of a GoPro for 1 day a week, but 1 hour, I don't know what I was saying before. And so, who is it for me to say? If they say that's what it's about, then fine. But my point is that I think the feeling like that is correct comes from the fact that it is an interpretation of what the piece is. And I wonder how people who feel that way would feel differently if they also had an interpretation of what the piece meant. And then maybe they would treat that as a little bit more level. Why does it matter that that's what the author thinks? You don't have to agree with this way of criticizing things. I will admit to you that I strongly do agree. It is utterly irrelevant what the person who made it thinks. I would go even further, actually, and this could be a topic for another time, and say I am often distrustful that the person who made the piece knows what they made. I'm not saying they didn't make it intentionally with things in mind. They did, or that they didn't notice little things about the piece, like were these words intended to be juxtaposed this way? They probably spent long enough writing it that they noticed things like that. I think people have a tendency to say, oh, they weren't thinking of that when they wrote it. They probably were. If you've ever edited anything you've written before, it's pretty hard not to notice these things if you pore over something you wrote. However, that does not mean that they are suddenly the prime interpreter of their own psychology. And this should be a simple claim for the very fact that people use and benefit from therapists. You don't magically know everything about the contents of your soul. And so it shouldn't be weird to say, just because you wrote it doesn't mean you know everything about what you meant by it. So even their own explanation of what it is may not be their interpretation of their own piece. I'm not trying to say it's not worth trusting people. It's interesting to hear what they have to say, but there's no primacy to the author's interpretation of their work. It is essentially made by no one once they are finished making it, in my opinion. But I'll get off my soapbox and stop proselytizing now. You can take or leave that logic. I hope I've expressed why I think it's helpful, simply because it causes you to have your interpretation of the text, which is like valuable in its own way, man. You can take it or leave it. I gather that rather than puzzling out the potential philosophical meaning of the person who wrote this, using the totality of the text as my evidence, Mr. Fu wants me to use it as a mirror held up to myself and to see what comes out of me when I read it. So that is what I will do for the middle chunk of this parlay. For the bolded segments, of course. Now, there are 3 of them. And so what I'm going to do is read the bolded segment and maybe remind you of some of the stuff around it as I go. I'm going to tell you my interpretation of the bolded segment in my plain English, like not poetically, basically. And then we'll talk about it a little bit, where it's coming from me. Not necessarily why it is the correct interpretation of the text. Although, I will still tell you a few other things in the text that made me think, like that made me think more about this. That made me think more about this. And if you didn't feel that way, your thing is right too. Your interpretation is also good. It's not fun or interesting to us as mutual intellectual equals to claim that one person is right. That's not desirable. That's the thing that always bothers me. It's like, not only is there no correct answer, it wouldn't be good if there was. Like it is a shallow thing worth growing out of to want that. Okay, let's go. So there's 3 bolded segments. We're going to do them one at a time. The first one is from near the beginning. Progress is a riddle of delays, serendipitously arranged. Okay, so my plain English interpretation of what that means to me as a mirror held up to myself is human beings do this weird thing as we progress in life where we construct this maze of all of the objections we can possibly muster to moving forward as people. In a very self-tragic way, we make it as hard and dramatic as possible, like pulling teeth, to do the thing that will make things better in our lives. And why? If I were to be positive for a moment, you could argue that this is it's cleaning out the attic. You know, when you really want to progress in your life, you want to move up in your life, a major change, you clean out every possible thing in the way to make it a real change. That's a positive way to look at it, sure. If I'm being negative, it's that we're all our own worst enemies, and that we can do nothing but get in our own ways in 1,000 complicated ways, because the assurance that we can be ourselves as we are now is more valuable to us subconsciously than the superior version of us that we imagine. I will go into some more detail. Let's say, for example, that you constantly bite your nails or whatever. Something we can agree is probably bad for you and you'd like to stop doing. This is kind of a silly example, but just something we can probably universally agree isn't that good. It could be something like you're in a relationship that it's not like actively physically harming you or something, but you've decided it's not that good and you should probably move on. The biting your nails thing is too trivial. It's weird. I think that deep down, a lot of people have this feeling like it's comfortable enough to just be who I am now in this relationship that I will mentally significantly resist changing my life for the rather immediately better, even though I think it will be almost immediately better, because it's just like nice. It's not actually nice, but like there's a feeling of coziness to like you could just be who you are now. And of course, being able to accept who you are now is very healthy. I guess that's the trick. It is kind of good, but being able to have courage and intrepidly move forward and try to be better as well, I think it's an equally human thing. And so it's interesting to see, perhaps then it makes sense, that humans create this clash when they try to move forward. The riddle of delays here, then, is the clash, the tangledness, the kicking and screaming is the way you'll go when you change, because you kind of want to stay the same and to change both a lot. I think this is a thing about humans generally. We can really enjoy being the way we are and have this undeniable drive to move forward. And thus there's a lot of tension, a lot of the kicking and screaming when you move forward. Progress is a riddle of delays, serendipitously arranged. I don't put very much weight on serendipitously here. It just means improvisationally, in the moment, a happy accident. I think it has a positive connotation. So to save you the looking it up, I guess I'll do that if there are any other weird words in here that I would think the average audience member might quickly want to refresher on. There's no shame in that. I don't think serendipitously here is doing a lot of weight. It has a great syncopation. I like how it flows in the song. This part of the song is doing a thing where progress is a riddle of delays, somewhat longer line, and then serendipitously arranged, a slightly shorter line, but serendipitously is a long word with a lot of syllables, so it kind of makes the line feel like both statements were of the same weight, even though they fit the kind of rhythm of the song. That's kind of cool from a musicality perspective, but I don't actually think serendipitously changes much about this. I suppose it just lightens the idea of the riddle of delays in my interpretation. It's just that it's not like you're engineering disaster for yourself. That's quite pessimistic. And I personally agree with that prompted thought that I'm getting from this piece of text. I don't think that it's something we do maliciously. There's this idea in psychology of self-sabotaging. And personally, I feel like that's a little overblown. It's like you don't want to fail. I personally feel like that's not engaging with the subject enough. Like, where is the resistance coming from? That's why I pointed to this idea that I think we humans often like to just be the way that we are too. And when you look at that, this is somewhat healthy to be able to think that way, and also somewhat holds you back, hence the tension. Now, the riddle of delays. It occurs to me you could interpret a lot of other ways, but again, here, Mr. Foot has asked us to not treat it as a puzzle to be solved, and to do anything other than just tell you what my reaction was would be the puzzle to be solved. Will I acknowledge that in my interpretation, riddle is like a slightly weird word for doing this? Yeah, and it might make more sense if you try to fit puzzle pieces from the rest of the text together, but I got this thought from it. So that's what I think. Progress is a riddle of delays, serendipitously arranged. I think we create these dramatic clashes as we change, and that the core from which those clashes stem is that we kind of want to both not change and change at the same time. That the change wins out is not statistically supported, actually. I think it's telling that plenty of people do change a lot and plenty of people don't. I don't think it's so wrong that a lot of people don't. It's just awfully good if you can. That's all I'd like to say. Okay, second one. This is from a lot later. It's for no good reason, I'd deceive you all just to get the point across. The first thing I thought of was it's essentially like the impulse of crying, a sort of primal way that we cry. We outwardly express our emotions, sometimes even against how we inwardly feel, because it is satisfying for people to know how we're feeling, basically. There's a feeling of how the mind acts with itself that I've been getting from this whole group of text. So kind of like the part before, you see how they're connected. Progress is a riddle of delays, serendipitously arranged, was to me a little bit about this idea that we self-sabotage a little bit and resist change that you could argue is good for us. And that's sort of the process, is navigating through that. And there's a drama to that feeling, like we overcomplicated it. Now, I think it's very healthy to acknowledge that this is just a thing humans do, and maybe it's okay. And that's just how it is. The song is called Just the Ride, after all. We'll get there, but... And I consider this one to be similar. For no good reason, I'd deceive you all just to get the point across. This one is much more direct. I mean, my plain English interpretation is sometimes humans kind of white lie and over-express themselves, or dramatically express themselves, or change the narrative of what they're saying about themselves, just to get across the point of like a way that they're feeling, or to make a point about how it made them feel, or how we felt to other people. This would be something like, well, this is petty, but you know, your partner eats the ice cream that you wanted, and so you eat their cannoli that they wanted. And they're like, why did you eat my cannoli? And you go, yeah, I was really hungry and I just wanted it a lot. When you consciously did it to get back at them so they would understand that you were upset that they ate your ice cream. And you know that, semi-consciously at the very least, and I think often people do it consciously. I mean, I don't think this is a good thing to do. I don't do this. This is not effective. You just have a conversation, but just get more ice cream. Anyway, but whatever, you know. And I can definitely relate to this in other ways. There is an element of this is worded in a way that's where it's kind of mundane, or it seems kind of petty, I guess. But again, I'm holding a mirror up to myself. What I get from this line of text is a kind of bigger problem, in my opinion, phenomenon, where it can be difficult for other people to see the immaterial struggle you have gone through in your life, and thus it can sometimes be desirable to sort of demonstrate in some way, leave their more of a problem so that people can kind of see that it was a struggle for you, I guess. Of course, this holds you back. And so, for example, in my work, where I'm my only employee most of the time, generally I try to notice when I would feel like, oh, but I'm just going to suffer quietly. It's like, well, no, we're just trying to pull it off quick like a band-aid. Just do your best. It's okay. If you need to talk about it, just tell the audience. Like on streams, sometimes I say something I'm frustrated with, rather than like leaving it a problem for longer than it would otherwise be. You know what I mean? But sometimes to communicate with people well, I would agree that it's legitimately necessary at times to kind of make it visible that there is something that is a struggle for us. I don't think that's that illegitimate of a thing. Now, again, I'm purposefully okay with this being a little further away from what the text is saying if I were to interpret it more literally, because that's kind of the point of this exercise. Mr. Food has asked us to not puzzle through what it means, and I'm claiming to you that I think it's valuable when you read something like this to embrace what it makes you think, what it makes you feel. And I'm giving you an example of that. So by saying, well, I don't think this is that close to exactly what it says, or I wouldn't say it this way, it's like, yeah, well, that's because I didn't write it. But what it makes me think is this. If I discern some other meaning from, puzzling it out or whatever, why is that good? That other meaning that doesn't resonate with me, why, let's say I like don't particularly agree too. Why is it good if I conclude that it means something that just doesn't mean anything to me? Who cares? You could then argue that one of the merits of a piece of writing like this could be, may or may not be, that it covers topics universal enough that they make me think something about the subject, even if I don't agree very much, resonate very much with this specific way of wording it. I would agree with some hypothetical writer that this is a type of behavior humans have a lot of. And I'm not really that interested in nitpicking whether I think most people do this specific iteration of that human tendency. To me, it seems sufficient, noteworthy, interesting, valuable, something to learn about myself, that I associated it quite loosely with the general problem of people not like seeing what's going on with you unless you sort of play act a problem that isn't there, or retwist the thing. The text even says for no good reason. Yeah, good is doing a lot of lifting there. There's a reason. It's just not a very good reason, is how I would read that anyway. Um, so fun. Again, something where while I don't like this line, I think it's fine in a song, and we're actually going to get to that later. This is one of my favorite lines in the song in terms of how it's sung. But as a piece of writing, this line is like blunt to the point of almost not saying anything. You know what I mean? It's like it doesn't have it. It's so general as to be almost comical. Like what? So it's self-defeating. To make it obscure and hard to understand would not be good, but to express a little more, to word paint a little more, and draw out maybe the way in which the person who wrote it was thinking, oh, I'm deceiving people to get a point across, and that's not that justified. This is so blunt that I don't really understand. It doesn't really feel like there's any spin on it. It's sort of like almost like not saying anything in a way. But it definitely gives me a general vibe because it is a very blunt, direct statement. Like I have no trouble thinking of, okay, just imagine someone deceiving people to get a point across for no good reason. That's easy. But like in what way, in what context? Of course, we have the rest of the piece. And while I'm not going to try to use the rest of the piece to puzzle out what this line means, it might be interesting to use the rest of the stanza thing, paragraph, whatever, these lyrics are in, to see if I resonate differently with some of the feelings. It's more poetically written. There's more of a slant on the idea. So let's read the whole chunk and see if that does anything for me. Ordinarily, we'd find a better fit and organize the message's intent with words and scenes, insinuations, emotional manipulation throughout. For no good reason, I'd deceive you all just to get the point across. Again, the emotional manipulation throughout and insinuations gives more of an idea of saying something between the lines because you feel kind of like less comfortable saying it directly, which is ironic because then this is one of the most blunt parts of the song. But It's amusing too, of course, in the context of doing this parlay. Ordinarily, we'd find a better fit, and to organize the message's intent is a puzzle that needs to be solved. Is the first thing I thought of. Perhaps off base with the rest of the piece. I'm not sure I'm getting from these lyrics that this is a song about not over interpreting art, but this part is shockingly similar to a thing we've been critiquing for the rest of the parlay. And that can be fun. It can be fun to understand things from different angles like that by thinking about it. Again, I'll repeat my thesis about it not really mattering what it actually means if you're focused on that. What would it do for you to know that? If you're on a thing while you're, reading these lyrics, it happens as one is wont to do. If you're doing parlay, which everybody does, it's a common job, and you have to interpret this type of lyrical chunk, this happens to literally no one ever. You are digging into a thought. People are sometimes uncomfortable directly saying what they feel and kind of present it or emotionally manipulate other people to get the point across of the thing they're feeling. This is a thing people do, sure. And right now I am chewing on that thought. Is it good if I derail that chewing so that I can, chew on the author's thought? Which I can never know I've actually discerned, by the way, even if it was for some reason valuable to have done so. No, it's valuable for you to focus on your own thing. Your own mental process of digging through the song is great, fine. Like, I would say clearly more valuable. Anyway, and again, this is also not me defending my interpretation. I don't resonate very much with this chunk of the song. And thus, I would imagine that a lot of the audience feels really differently, like doesn't have a very harmonious interpretation with what I said, or is more focused on what did the writer mean by this in this section. And that's fine. Yeah, that's great. You probably got more out of it than I did. If you don't get anything out of it, what is the problem with trying to discern what the author thought? Like nothing, that's fine. As long as you don't feel like that is the thing you're supposed to do, is just the thing that I think Mr. Foot and I are pushing back against really hard. Okay, part 3. This is from the end. And I've been to nothingness and barely bothered to survive. And I laughed when your levee broke to shed tears when nobody rose. A levee is like a dam or wave-breaking structure in a bay. Man-made, usually, I believe, wave-breaking, like a dam or a barrier against the tide. So I'll read it again. And I've been to nothingness and barely bothered to survive. And I laughed when your levee broke to shed tears when nobody rose. The 2 lines before it, that was what Mr. Foot bolded, but the 2 lines before it are, you might recall, and I've been a hypocrite, and I'm certain I have lied. And I'm going to interpret those as well because it's useful to my reading. This section to me is also concluded with to say it's just a ride, and to me feels like a comfortable thesis statement for the other 2 sections we talked about. We're talking here, I'm getting from this part that we are talking here about basically like the way that humans are fickle, hypocritical in the way they express, and how that drama makes it feel like weird to relax, I guess. So hypocrite and certain I've lied we'll leave aside for now, but think of those as themes, almost like the title of this section. And then, and I've been to nothingness and barely bothered to survive. I'm getting depression that I experienced a lot of in high school, mostly. Tale as old as time for a lot of people, I'm sure. And I laughed when your levee broke to shed tears when nobody rose. To me, I recalled mocking other people with their troubles and then being upset when nobody else related myself. Very hypocritical, as I certainly have been. And then it's jarring to me, and yet I have concluded that I need to be willing to say, yeah, I did do that. It's pretty weird that I barely bothered to like put the effort in to survive and get through the depressive feeling I had or the wonderful potential life that was on my plate when I was younger. And it's ridiculous how much I mocked other people trying their best and felt mocked, or at least not related to, when I was trying my best with something no one cared about. For me to then go say, go with the flow. But that is how I think I need to be. Okay, so I made a lot of janky mistakes and acted very not with it and was not chill with it for a huge amount of the time I have existed so far. It now feels a bit ridiculous of me, very hypocritical, to say, let's just relax about it and try to go with the flow and roll with the punches. That is the story of my life, is not doing that. It is kicking and screaming against that. And I'm sure I mean, when we're younger, this is the story of a lot of people's lives. But that doesn't change what I must do. I don't see a mental health way forward than my current theme for this chunk of my life. I have a thing written right on my desk here that says "Steady as she goes," which for me, my reading of this song is essentially the same as saying this last stanza. So for me, I quite quickly, yeah, I have been feeling that vibe lately, and that's my version of the vibe I got from this chunk of the song. Pretty cleanly, but I could imagine this would bring a lot of images to people. We'll just briefly, as we transition into the end of the parlay, where we're going to talk about interpreting things this way generally, things we missed because it wasn't a song. We didn't, you may have, I did before the parlay, but a lot of you did not listen to this as a song, at least not first. And so things we missed from doing that and some other stuff. As a transition point, I want to point out the verbiage, the serendipitously and levy, two words that I highlighted as things that I guess a good amount of the audience wouldn't have had a comfortable definition of off the top of their heads. I don't mean to belittle any of you. There's nothing wrong with not knowing those words, but I just thought maybe that would get in some people's way of experiencing that. And certainly, you could argue that they are not necessary. That if the text is not meant to be some puzzle to be solved, why does it have these words you need to look up? Now, I think that a lot of the people who would be reading these as lyrics and digging into this stuff would know what at least serendipitously meant. And to some extent, I think "and I laughed when your levee broke" is, if you're interpreting things at a relatively abstract level, you can kind of get what a levee is through context. Like, it doesn't really matter what broke, I guess. Unless you're assuming it's like, do they mean when your water broke? Is it pregnancy? Are they referencing an actual natural disaster? Like, as long as you don't worry about it being a specific like that, I would argue that levee here you kind of don't need the meaning of. You can just get that it's when other people had a misfortune or push came to shove, you laughed, and then that juxtaposes, because we've gotten, two lines, laughed when your levee broke, to me juxtaposes with shed tears when nobody rose. I take those as being flip sides. You laughed when other people sad, and you sadded when other people laughed. Not necessarily laughed, but they didn't rise to come help you, to commiserate with you, whatever you want to say. That's what I got from that. But my point is, yeah, you kind of provided an attitude that will get what you can from it, rather than looking for the correct answer. You kind of don't need to know what levee means, but serendipitously there, you could say improvisationally or something, and that doesn't fit the flow of the song so poorly. Progress is a riddle of delays, improvisationally arranged. It's like worse, but fine, you could argue. I guess I just feel like it's not that is maybe a less poorly known word, and so was it really that bad for them to do that? I definitely know, though, that a lot of people, when they experience or see a piece of text like this, they see that the use of those pieces of verbiage as proof that it is trying to be clever and that it is not a word painting, basically. Why would you say, "Watch the embers wither into gray and the filament fade, oh, and the filament fades, if you didn't want to confuse people. Some people tend to say. I would like to say that associating them generally, I really do think you get in the habit of it. An image comes to mind, and that image is fine, and you can continue forward. Much like how describing every single detail of every piece of clothing on a protagonist in a fantasy novel is simply not necessary. It's okay for you to picture who you picture. And for key points like maybe a sword with an ornate lock-like hilt to be specifically described, because that's a Chekhov's gun that will be used later in the story. Like, sure, and you'll describe that, and then whatever kind of sword they're picturing, or whatever kind of garb or stature or amount of scruffle on the face of the protagonist, you do not need to, and indeed many pieces do not, take pains to describe, because it just doesn't matter that much. It's not about discerning a single correct interpretation. But people just really take assurance in that. And it's understandable why, of course. Not to hit the nail on the head too much in a parlay that I'd argue isn't about people's insecurity with interpreting art, but I feel like this is a little bit about people's insecurity of interpreting art. I would hope to some people, obviously, or you'll accept when I suggest, that the reason people feel uncomfortable doing that and want there to be a single answer is because if there isn't a single answer, then your interpretation of this piece is your personality, laid bare on the page for other people to judge. And this can be uncomfortable. That's fine. I mean, you can poke holes in my insecurities for what I just did. I am personally more than fine with this. I did do it for 4 years in college, but I mean, I wasn't at all open with myself then. I just made up whatever for class. And it was the pointlessness of that 4 years that has caused me to think this now, that made it obvious to me that it's just valueless to try to find a single answer. And this is not an uncommon opinion. You'll find many people have come to this conclusion too, and you go ahead and disagree and come to your own. But yeah, I would encourage people to feel like it's not there, and that maybe filament, for example, here is being used because it feels a certain way, maybe nostalgic. Watch the embers wither into gray and the filament fade made me think of taking a picture with an old camera and the like instant the picture comes out and there's the like, and it kind of develops instantly. I don't know that much about cameras, but that thing that happens with instant cameras and old film. And there's a sort of awareness of the impermanence of existence thing in that type of technology generally, and specifically cameras, and trains are another common symbol used that way. A train coming for just a minute and then leaving. That's often used in a similar way. It brought to mind those symbols. The kind of impermanence and moving target of our existence is how I felt about that. And I don't see what the point would be of there being another meaning to it. I mean, I'm interested in what other people think, sure. But I'm interested in what other people think because I'm interested in other people, not because their interpretation is valuable in any way other than that it is theirs, that it came from them. And I'm just interested in them, or you, I guess, as I would say. Anyway, that was my final note about, I think people would have fun interpreting things if they didn't think it was out to get them, I guess. And the final thing that I imagine a lot of people would feel like, no, but that's still out to get me, is just, I just don't know what these words are, and why did they choose those words? Like, what is the point of that? It is that it is a word painting. It feels a certain way, that word, rather than another word. Serendipitously here fits in a way that's saying improvisationally, which doesn't really mean the exact same thing anyway, but doesn't. It feels different in here. And I mean, or it feels different to me anyway. That makes sense to me. Maybe you would have preferred improvisationally, or you don't see a merit in this exercise, and I think that's fine too. That's also an interpretation. This is pointless. Okay, fine. It's not objectively pointful. So go figure. A few closing comments. Because we didn't get it as a song, and I'm not really reviewing the song, I don't really feel like you wanted me to do that, Mr. Food. I will just briefly comment on the song. I thought it was interesting. It is a somewhat through-composed song, I clocked before. It is not a song that follows as clean of a verse, chorus, bridge, chorus structure. And thus, as you're reading these 4 stanzas, if you like, they do build in terms of just the the loudness and the progression of the music, which makes it feel like one thought in a way that I think when a lot of people look at text on a page, it doesn't look like one thought. It maybe looks like four thoughts. Now, my using the text as a mirror up to my personality interpretation was that they are connected statements. It's like different versions of a tendency humans have, and then the conclusion of the thesis statement, if you will, is it's just a ride. Life, even though we do these insane things with our brains as we move forward, like that's what it is. You know, that's not like wrong or a bug. It can be like bad in its own way. There's not necessarily a good reason to do it that way, but that is just what we are as humans, is what the song suggests. Not entirely sure I agree with that, but I agree that that is a distinct phenomenon present in humans. I'm just not sure I agree that it needs to be there, but that's a topic for another time. Anyway, go figure. I think this song is pretty good with it about that tendency, and I don't have as positive an interpretation of that about humans. I personally feel most of these phenomena are things that are possible to and worth overcoming, but they are definitely our starting point, most of us, sure. Whereas I feel like the song is more okay with, like, it is what it is, like, that's okay. And yeah, it's okay, but I mean, could we do more, perhaps? You know, anyway, it's not what the parlay is about. Just to say that I think it feels more like a united thought, maybe, to me, when it's a song. And it occurs to me that people who are not as comfortable interpreting their own idea of a text, as a song, when you can't hear the lyrics individually as clearly, and you pick out bits and pieces, and the song is a united whole rather than stanzas, a person who was going to get hung up on exactly what it means may engage more with it as a kind of autopilot setting. It may come across better as a piece of music, even though it's the same text. And I'd like to note that when that happens, I think it's that people tend to insist that they know what the song is about, pulling out one lyric, when, I mean, of course they don't. There is no single thing the song is about. And so they're doing the thing that I harped on a lot in this parlay, that Mr. Foot asked me to do in this parlay, but just claiming that it is the correct thing. And maybe could I ask those people to go one step further and say, what if you just don't insist that that's the correct thing, force it to be the correct thing? You basically are doing the thing I was suggesting, just not when it's laid out as text. I think that goes school correct answer test to a lot of people, whereas listening to it normally, it just occurred to me, if I had the choice, I would let the audience listen to this and then invite them to dig into interpreting it as text with me. I'm perfectly happy to kind of do that myself, but I thought if I wanted someone to do the thing I did, I wouldn't show them it as words. I would make them listen to it as a song. It's just something I thought was interesting. Just have fun. It's just the ride. You could start doing that with anything. It's just the ride, to mean literally anything, to serve any purpose. And I don't think that's that valuable either. I think having it be a coherent thesis statement, even if it's just yours, is still helpful if you're going to interpret stuff like this. It's pretty interesting. There's been a lot of music-related parlay lately. I don't know why that is, but interesting. Looking forward to seeing where you go next. I know, Mr. Foot, you were kind of taking a break from your long Invisible Wall series, though we're going back to it. I've looked ahead in the parlay prompts. And so that's part of where it's coming from. But there are some of you who've been requesting music-related parlay a lot recently, which I hope you're enjoying what I'm doing with them. It's a perfectly fine mental exercise for me. That's why I do this for a living. So I'm neither in favor or against them. I just think it's interesting that that's been happening. So looking forward to seeing the next ones. Folks, if you want to get your own parlay about whatever the heck you want, by the way, you can do that using a link in the description. Love to have you with us. Looking forward to the next one.